Hello everyone, it's your favorite West Virginia in space here, and Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur is a show I consider to be kind of middling to okay. Nothing terribly notable, but rarely anything truly bad or offensive about it. And that seems to kind of be its placement. However, it has recently gone to a lot of public discussion due to its lost/banned episode, depending on the word that. However, it got me thinking, and we will come to that episode, don't worry, but how the show has always kind of had a bad track record of when it's, to lack of a better term, when its politics get in the way of its world building, or more specifically when the two do not work in a way that makes sense. So in this video, we're going to go over the 3 times that I can remember in Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur when they tried to get political and then kind of messed it up. I do want to say that Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur is not a terribly political show. Most episodes literally have nothing to do with it, and even sometimes they do touch on the more serious issues and do it better. It just seems like whenever they try to deal with these politics things, they have a bad habit of running into the world building or otherwise kind of running into weird issues. So anyway, let's begin. We are starting off, believe it or not, with the very first episode of the show, which I know is kind of a bad showing, but it is something that stood out for me the second I saw it. And it was that the grandma character, I believe it was, said, you know, like when they were talking about like some superhero stuff in the plot, they're going on like the Avengers never come over here or no superhero ever comes to our area of the city, right? Heavily implying, now this is supposed to very clearly be a reference / allegory or whatever to how cops and law enforcement are sometimes prone to not going into heavily crime-ridden areas, even especially sometimes if they're controlled by like blacks or considered quote-unquote ghetto areas and blah blah blah. And that's a whole serious topic that we don't have to get into today. But the important bit is that the logic doesn't work out terribly well. I get what they're going for, the idea that no superheroes come into this area of the city, so that's why Moon Girl needs to exist to defend this area. That makes sense in theory, but there's a detail about Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur that some people have kind of forgotten. It's a Marvel show. It takes place in one of the Marvel universes. And one that is, quote-unquote, standard enough that most of the standard rules of these characters in the world can apply. So, like, the Avengers are the Avengers we know, Spider-Man's the Spider-Man we know, within, like, that kind of reason, right? So this isn't, like, a heavily divergent universe. So that does lead to the question of, well, would there be any heroes defending her area? Yes, there would be already heroes defending that area of New York. Like, New York and Marvel is just filled with tons of heroes. Like, an absolutely staggering amount of heroes hang out more or less just in New York City. Now, granted, the list sometimes changes, but in general, there are teams consisting, once again, kind of shifting around. There's the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the Defenders, New Warriors, Midnight Suns, all located within the states, and those are just the individual teams. You're counting individual characters, then you go everyone from Luke Cage, Daredevil, Punisher, Jessica Jones, Moon Knight, Iron Fist, and of course, bloody Spider-Man, and probably dozens of other heroes I can't even be bothered to mention right now because I forgot about them. That is a staggering amount of heroes. There is no real logical reason her area of the city would just not be protected at all, especially because, once again, most of these heroes will venture out of New York if necessary, and a lot of these heroes basically just defend the whole area of New York. So why would her area be somehow specially immune that no heroes show up here? Well, I know some people say, once again, it's trying to be an allegory of things, so racism, but that doesn't make sense, as that implies that all of those Marvel heroes are racist and won't go into areas heavily populated by black people, which is incredibly stupid, because A, we know a lot of these characters just aren't racist, and B, a lot of those characters are black. Like, I mean, seriously, do you think characters like War Machine, Storm, Black Panther, or Falcon are just going to not show up to a black heavily area because they're black? Like, that doesn't even make logical sense. And then we got characters like Captain America who are so anti-bigoted, they can literally repulse an attack from a weapon designed to turn anyone into a bigot against everyone else that no one else seems to be immune to. But apparently against this one black community, he's just completely not caring. It doesn't make sense. It logically is incredibly stupid, and it just doesn't make sense. This one little bit of line, if it was its own independent superhero universe, right? Where, like, it was kind of like something like maybe The Boys, or like the Aberrant RPG, where it's like the heroes are a bit more shady, a bit more corrupted. This could have worked. But in the Marvel world, it just doesn't work. Like, But I was willing to kind of, I don't want to say forgive it, but, I was willing to look past it, because first episodes, pilot episodes, are always kind of weird. You get this little bit of shankiness. So they probably just wanted to have an explanation for, why other heroes won't show up in the show more frequently later on, and that's kind of forgivable, if not really necessary. I mean, no one questions it was like Spider-Man, but overall, it's not that big of a deal, even if it has some really weird implications. This next one is a little bit more tricky. This next weird bit comes from the season 2 episode Roller Jam, and it was written / came out in 2024. That is an important detail going forward. Now, I won't go over the whole plot of the episode, but the important part of that episode that's for this discussion is when there was basically a flashback scene where the grandpa of Moon Girl and his ex-friend were talking about their past, and how because all the other roller skate places in the city were racist and wouldn't let black people in, they had to go build their own. And it kind of made sense. It made sense in the context of the episode, right? I'm saying it's out of context, but in context it had meaning and all that jazz, right? Which is fine. It was a solid flashback scene, explanation of the friendship and past. It made sense, right? Until you started to think about the character's ages in any considerable way. Because the grandpa character is not like an old curmudgeon who can't do anything. If you look at his design, he's maybe early 50s. Maybe if you I'm really stretching with early 50s. He at most, you could say he's maybe mid 50s. That's at most. So I'd say he's probably closer to 40, given his just general he has obviously some graying / whiting going on, but he still has a lot of color in his beard. And this would make sense because Moon Girl in show is 13, so if we assume he was around 25-ish when he had his kid, who then went on to have Moon Girl, that person was probably, if you look at her parents in the show, they look like early 30s, so, 50s, early 50s kind of work, maybe, but it gets tricky because of the history of the civil rights movement. Because this flashback was supposed to have taken place when he was a young man. Specifically him, not his dad or someone else. It was him specifically. And there was no roller skate place in the entirety of the city, which is New York City, mind you, that would let black people in it. So this is implying it was during the days of segregation. That's the obvious implication if they won't just say it. That's what they're implying. But the problem is, if he was about 50 now in 2024, when the show was written / set, how could he have been, he wouldn't have not just been a young man during the days of segregation, he wouldn't have been alive. Now, granted, there were certain, exactly when you could say segregation ended is a little bit of a tricky subject because there are multiple laws that factored into it. Some would say exactly for this discussion, 1964 would probably be relevant, as that was when businesses could stop segregating for the most part. It was kind of tricky, there was a few more years. So there's some wiggle room with when you want to say this could happen. But the thing is, if he was 50 by the current time of the show, when it was written, 2024, he would have been 20 in the 90s. There is no possible way that in New York City in the 90s, there was not a single roller skating place that would let black people in. It wasn't just these two, by the way. It's all black people. They just wouldn't let any of them in. Especially because roller skating has apparently a lot of ties to black culture that I didn't know about until my friend pointed out. But the point is, so that doesn't make sense timeline-wise. Weirdly enough, this would have worked kinda if the show was written in the 2000s, the early 2000s, but it doesn't work in 2020, or the 2020s. It just, if he was older maybe, but he's clearly not old enough for that to work. So it's a clear indication that the writers don't know the history of the civil rights movement, and you might say, maybe the history of the civil rights is different in Marvel? No. Even if you want to try to finagle years around a little bit, it's just, no. The Marvel Universe does not have such a different history of civil rights that you could explain that away. It's just the writers not understanding the history of the civil rights movement, which is kind of a problem when you're trying to do this thing about important, serious historical stuff, and clearly got the dates so wrong that it just does not operate correctly, at all. But overall, that was frustrating because clearly, that was more frustrating than the first one, really, because that was really touching on serious, real-world stuff, and they just got so completely wrong. It's obviously there's still plenty of struggles people face today, but it's not like that. I mean, especially because it was so difficult for them in the show that they couldn't go to any roller skate place and had to start their own. I'm pretty sure in the 90s, suing one of those places over this would have been very easy. Not to mention the fact they mentioned specifically that these roller skating places were celebrating Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which I don't quite understand. Like, Martin Luther King, okay, it's a federal holiday. I could see them doing it just to keep appearances, or maybe just an excuse to do whatever. But like Malcolm X, I don't understand why a all-right racist roller skating rinks would be celebrating Malcolm X, especially all of them, all over the city of New York. And at the latest, like the absolute most you could push it back for this character in the 90s. Nothing about that makes any sense if you know even the tiniest bit of history. It's utterly baffling to me. But believe it or not, that's not the worst case of this, because we have to go over that episode. Now, going into the band episode of Moon Girl is very tricky because it has a lot of complex political talk going around it, and it touches on real-world issues, which I'm not necessarily opposed to cartoons going into, as they have done historically, to sometimes very important and good effect. Where this episode struggles, though, is that it's not goodly written. It's very badly written on many levels, both politically and just internally. It's a very badly written episode. And it kind of starts off pretty simple with what the message is itself. Now, the coach lady who we see is supposed to be a stand-in for, like, all the people who don't want trans women in women's sports. For generally, though some are bigots, a lot of the main concern, and especially more reasonable people, is that trans athletes are so much better at sports than women that it would kick out all natural women from being able to compete or win serious prizes. So this could be an interesting topic to delve into in a cartoon, and probably the last thing you would want to do is turn that person into a cartoonish villain. Which is exactly what they did. She's a cartoonish villain who is willing to trap kids in a death dungeon. Now, some people will say that the coach mom is innocent. She is not. She is definitely a villain in the episode. Like, no matter whether you agree with her or not on trans athletes, it's not important, because what is important is that she was willing to throw children into a death trap with lava and cheat games. That is definitively evil stuff. It's just, she's not forgivable for that. So she's not like some sympathetic hero. She's just evil. And that's just a fact. I mean, there's no way to skirt around that. But it does not deny that the writers made her that comically evil for really a bizarre reason. Like, I get it. They don't agree with that. They agree, for trans athletes. And that's, a fine opinion. But maybe construct the episode in a way that doesn't literally turn one side into the cartoon villain. What makes it even worse is that you think what they would do is like try to say that, oh, she didn't believe she was a real woman, but they don't do that. Like, she calls her a former boy. She never tries to dead name Rook at all. Like, you think you would do that. Like, you're like, they just don't. Which, ironically enough, makes her original position seem a lot more reasonable. That she isn't a bigot. She just, well, at least not in the comical, easy way of she doesn't believe she's a boy. But they don't do that, which I always found very odd. I'm not sure quite what to do about that. But structurally, what makes it even worse is that one of the major complaints or worries people have about trans athletes in women's sports is the idea that they would be so much better fit at sports than biological women or whatever, that they would be able to easily, outcompete the biological women, would never win any female sports again, and that is a legitimate concern. So probably the last thing you would want to do is have the trans woman in the show, in this one episode, be so hyper-competent that she makes little superheroes look like chums. Which is exactly what happens, because when they're trapped in that multi-key death dungeon, Rook is literally the one doing basically everything. Her teammates are completely useless. Moon Girl occasionally helps, but for most of the time, it's Rook saving Moon Girl, who, need I remind you, is a superhero. So, you did not just not touch on the major concern people have about this, that aren't just being, mean to trans people. You just literally made it worse to the point that, I'm gonna say this, in this episode, Rook is not only just a bland character whose entire personality is, I'm trans. Seriously, that's her entire personality in this episode. I can't remember if she showed up before, but in this episode, at least, that's the only thing about her. But I'm gonna say she's a Mary Sue. Now, I do structurally go by this definition of Mary Sue of where they're so much more hyper-competent than everyone else in a way that doesn't make sense in universe, but also the variation that points out when they bend the laws of the show around them. How do I say this? Well, it's actually quite simple. Moon Girl herself. Because in case you forgot, this show is Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. Moon Girl is the main character. So, logically speaking, the superhero in the room should probably be at least somewhat competent at this, helping out in this life or death situation. And granted, she is a gadget-based hero. She's kind of like a Tony Stark kind of character who relies on their tech. But this is a pretty common archetypical episode of superheroes of, oh no, I can't use my gadgets because I don't have them here, or I can't suit up because then the normies will know my secret identity, so I'm forced to do this in my civilian identity. That is a pretty common episode structure and does usually allow for more lesser side characters to be important. But usually the episode also can show that the hero is competent without them, or can use their skills in creative ways. In this episode, Moon Girl is just utterly useless. She does one thing that's vaguely helpful throughout the entire episode, I'm pretty sure. And she never at all mentions anything about not being able to use her gadgets, or not having her super suit, or not being able to change into Moon Girl. Which is just basic stuff for this kind of show. I am utterly convinced in this episode the writers forgot she was a superhero. And it gets even worse because the entire episode she's acting really incompetent and very clumsy in a way she doesn't act the rest of the show. She's not super agile. She once again does rely on her tech, but she's shown to be competent when she doesn't have her tech and can outthink the enemy. She's supposed to be hyper intelligent. And in most episodes, although sometimes overconfident and classic smart character makes mistakes because they can't see the consequences of their actions, but she's never been portrayed as dumb. Except in this episode, where she is just utterly stupid and utterly useless. Which, once again, it feels very Mary Sue fanfiction of, here's my special OC who's so much cooler than the main character, not because they actually are cool, but because I dumbed the main character down to stupidity. Which does not help this episode in the slightest. Remember, this just does not make sense logically. And even then, the whole ending of the episode was very weird, how her friend's oh, we support you, when in the death trap they were utterly useless. Literally useless, which once again does not help the message or the worry that people have that, trans women will be so much better at sports because this entire team of women is utterly useless in this episode, and the only one who does anything is the trans person. I'm almost convinced this episode was written by some right-wing person as a psyop or something. But it wasn't, to my knowledge. And it just doesn't make sense. And it gets even not worse, but there is the one detail that I've always found funny that one of my friends pointed out, that in the end, the trans girl Rook doesn't escape the simulation by outplaying the game, or manipulating it, or beating the challenges, or doing some kind of confirmation of who she really is, or anything like that. She just gets mad and breaks things. She just gets mad, smashes it, and then wins because she got mad. And granted, there's a lot of reasons to be mad, but it doesn't really help her character. Not only does it really not fit into the stereotype of angry trans women, but it also is just very, weird from a narrative perspective. It doesn't really help the Mary Sue thing either. She just gets mad and somehow escapes a simulation that's designed to keep people in unless they break out of certain very specific rules. Which also another question, where did she get that key from? I know she got it on a yard sale, but how did it end up there? Was it secretly some device? Was it secretly the Lock in a Dimension Keyinator by Dr. Doofenshmirtz? Was it that? Or was it lost by Professor Egad? I don't know. But overall, this episode was just really bad. On multiple levels. Politically, it makes no sense. And writing-wise, it was even worse. So I see why it was banned. Or forgotten, not more accurately forgotten. Although, of course, that's a big stinker for both sides, yippee. But overall, that's just my opinions. I'd love to hear what you think about this episode and the show overall. Believe it or not, despite this entire episode, video being me ripping into it, I don't think it's a bad show. It's just when it gets political, it has a tendency to run into its own world building in ways that just don't make a whole lot of sense. But overall, like I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like, comment, subscribe down below. If you don't like, just like and tell me why and all that jazz. And I will see you all next time. Yeah. Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscribble. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.